All right, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our dialogue discussion on artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence. We have with us tonight one of our dialogue coordinators, Brian Garr. He is going to lead this discussion, and I'm going to run the IT part of everything, make sure everything goes smoothly. So my name is Christina, and I'm with Atlantic Institute, by the way, in case I just forgot to do that. If you have questions, you can feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll get to them, or we can come back to them when you have a minute. And I'm going to go ahead, and Brian, you can go ahead and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Christina. Welcome to this conversation on generative artificial intelligence. Will it change the way we work? I'm Brian Garr, your moderator, and we're fortunate enough to have with us two very influential and knowledgeable individuals from the world of generative artificial intelligence. First, let me introduce Dr. Aurel Lommel, who leads up CSA's research's data services practices and has worked with translation technology for many years. Prior to joining CSA Research, he worked for the German Research Center for Artificial Intelligence in Berlin. His work has long emphasized the role of augmentation of humans rather than their replacement, thank goodness, as a primary goal of AI. And next is Carl Mokel, who is a user experience architect concentrating on how generative AI changes business processes and ability to innovate. And he uses his background in design and innovation to help people understand and plan for the changes being brought by generative AI. So I thought it would be good to start with a working definition of general AI. And what Wikipedia tells us is generative AI is artificial intelligence capable of generating text, images, or other media using generative models. And generative AI models learn the patterns and structures of their input training data and their generative new data that has similar characteristics. So Aurel and Carl, do you want to modify that definition or augment it? How do you feel about that as a working definition?
Well, I guess I can go ahead. I think it's a fairly good definition. In a sense, we're just hearing a lot about generative AI lately, but it's been around a bit longer than sort of the popular perception. If we look at machine translation, for instance, arguably that's generative AI.
Yep. And
it's using the same fundamental technologies as other generative models. So it's been around for a while. I think it's a good definition. And one thing I would highlight that's often a misconception, even among people who should know better, is that when we talk about generative, that means it's creating things that are new, not just indexing and retrieving. And you'll see a lot of misunderstanding about this in media coverage of the technology.
Yep. Carl, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I agree with that. It's a fairly good one. I think that people need to understand that when they say generative AI, you hear it almost always with text, but it's with images. It's becoming animation. I mean, people are using it to be able to control robots, so that the idea of it, only being like a chatbot is not what it's about. The reality of where you want to be looking for it is you want to see like all the places that it can touch in the future, because that's where a lot of the more real changes are coming. It's actually kind of a small change that it can make chatting sound, more realistic.
Right. So it's not just conversational AI, certainly MT and all sorts of other areas that are being generated, artwork, content, marketing content. One thing I like to highlight when I talk about AI is that AI, by definition, AI has an error rate. So it's important to understand that if it was perfect, it would not be AI. By the definition of what AI is and how it's trained and how if it's overtrained, then it may be closer to 100%, in which case it's not really prepared to handle everything. Whereas true AI has an error rate, whether it's content creation. One of the things they talk about generative AI is that it has hallucinations. Carl, you want to talk to hallucinatory generative AI for a sec?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing you have to understand, like if you've seen the ones where a lawyer used it to be able to write a brief, and then like, tried to show like, here's the brief I wrote, but all of the context of that came from what didn't actually exist. And the same thing can go in other places. If you look at the images ones and they don't draw hands and stuff realistically, it's not that the AI doesn't, the AI doesn't know about hands. It's not actually a personal intelligence. What it's done is it's looked at a lot of images and it's trying to replicate those. And, out of that comes errors because it doesn't understand things from the human perspective. And so, there's two aspects of hallucination. There's the fact that it technically gets it wrong because it doesn't actually understand things. It's pulling from all these different places and trying to factor them together to become a new way of looking at something. And then it's just the fact that it's not in some ways it's not a very complex system, and so that it doesn't understand all the different connections that we might make about things.
Right.
And so in not making those connections, it makes the wrong, what you consider the wrong observation.
So it's generative AI, especially ChatGPT, things like that, will tell you with great confidence things that are totally false.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting dynamic. So
If
let's
I
get
can-
down to, go ahead,
Well,
Carl.
also
I'm sorry.
too, that it's people talk about hallucination as if it's the result of bad training data often, but it's actually just a consequence of the system generating. You can't just say we're going to fix all the data and that will eliminate hallucination. It's because the system's doing what it's supposed to, which is generate things. Sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong.
Yeah.
And there's no way to separate, to the extent that they want these things to be creative. Well, there's no way to separate hallucination from being creative.
Right. Right. So let's turn to business for a second, because this is supposed to be about how it's going to affect the workforce. IBM CEO Arvind Krishnan announced the company plans to replace nearly 8,000 jobs with AI. Back office functions, specifically in the human resource sector, will be the first to face these changes. Are these the kind of changes we're going to see in SMBs as well? What kind of job losses? I've seen projections in, 1 million jobs over the next 5 years. What are you hearing from your clients and your enterprises about what kind of job losses we're going to see?
I think what you mostly hear is you're instead of it being like what you consider blue collar jobs where it's hands on, it's about the white collar jobs, and it's because it's going to change the nature of how people, create information and get information. So instead, like a lawyer, you could have had, all your assistants going out there and they're going into all of the books and all of the cases and they're reading them and they're summarizing them and they're putting them into a Word document and then say, here's our summary of about this case.
Right.
Right now, you could create a specialized, large language model that can go out and do that and do a really good job of it. Now you can go back to the hallucinations thing and say, it won't get it all right, but it'll do a very good summarization that you can use as a much better starting point, and you're going to get it in 2 minutes.
So that means that the law firm, the guys that do the research, are out of work.
If they're not out of work, the nature of their work is going to change a lot because it's going to go from doing all of this piecemeal research to taking the summary and trying to just check it and then make sure that they pass on the appropriate and right information.
Right. So Arl, is the advice to college graduates: learn how to write prompts for generative AI?
Well, I think that's certainly going to be part of it, and if your idea of your job was, well, to take the example of doing legal discovery, if you've been asked to summarize this and you've been given a mountain of discovery, probably 95% of what you're doing is weeding stuff out that isn't adding value, because all you're doing is saying this isn't relevant, this isn't relevant, this isn't, till you find the one thing. So to that extent, a lot of that work was always waste. Now, it was necessary waste, but if you can automate that, now you could have people who, rather than reading it and noting it, are going to be saying, okay, what does this mean? And trying to analyze it and moving up. So I think there will be some loss of jobs that were generated by that waste, but we're going to see creation of new jobs, and some of it will be around writing prompts to figure out how can you automate things and speed things along and ferret what you know is there that maybe a simple prompt doesn't return.
Right, right. Also in the content creation area where generative AI can create entire scripts. Just as an anecdote, I wrote a press release for a company I work with for a partnership with another company. And I sent the press release to the other company and said, is this good? Can we release this? Do you approve this? And they sent back and said, this is fine, but here's what our generative AI wrote. And they sent me a whole new press release that was far superior to the one that I had written, with just beautiful words and lovely language and many more keywords for keyword searches. So content creators, what happens to content creators under this new generative AI area?
They become a lot more effective. Because like the thing you can say about it, like you were just saying, is like making sure that you get the keywords in there, making sure that the language is correct, making sure that you have the right tone for your company. All of those things before you're kind of like you asked a person to do the work, and then you're kind of somewhat hoping that they would remember to do all of the things. Whereas with prompt engineering, the prompt can be exactly do this, do this, do this, do this, and it will do all those things, and it'll be, it'll make sure that almost all those things get in there. Now, to the point on the side of hallucination is it's not going to do everything perfectly, because some of the things you might ask for it may not know about. The data may not be in there for it to be able to use to gather, especially about your company's IP. So it's like you can have it write a press release and it'll do really great on all the parts which are public knowledge that the AI had access to, the large language model had access to, but it's going to do a really bad job on the part of the talking that has to do with it's very specific to your company, because it didn't have access to that unless that's something you fed to it in the prompt.
Yeah. So Arl, do you see that the next course you're going to take in college is prompt engineering?
I think it's going to be baked into everything sooner or later. And there's actually a real boon here for people whose native language isn't English as well. So at CSA Research, we have a marketing manager whose native language is Arabic, and he's near native in French. And he has become far more effective because he can put down in his, reasonable but not great English, put a prompt in and get something out that it just speeds him up so much, and it's made him far more effective.
So it's a good point. Let's move on to some discussions about language, because language is so important. Does generative AI care about language? How does it do with language? Arl, that's really your area.
So this is an interesting question. It's highly variable. And a lot of people have, sort of anecdotally said, wow, I tried ChatGPT and it does a great job translating from German to English. It's just going to replace everything. But when we look at the training data that's gone into this, it's about 54% of it in Common Crawl, which is what this draws on, is from English.
Right.
And it's, I think, 76% is European languages or English, or maybe, no, 86, I think it was.
Yeah.
But in fact, when they were creating it, they tried to strip out non-English data. And it sort of was an accident that it can translate it all. So there really is this bias towards just a few languages. Now, if you want to apply it to something like Albanian or Finnish, you're going to get much, much worse performance.
Right.
So maybe it would replace some things in some languages, but as a general proposition, it's not there yet.
So what's interesting is for our listeners here, when you train a generative AI, a large language model rather, right now what it's doing is crawling through billions of web pages that could be in any language. And if it finds, for example, let me admit this person, if it finds multiple pages of the same data in different languages, it's like having a Rosetta Stone. So it basically can teach itself new languages simply by absorbing the same pages in different languages. So machine translation has been around commercially since really the 80s and 90s, and it's gone through rule-based, and it's gone through statistical, and now neural MT. So will LLMs be the new MT of choice, or will neural MT win the day?
Well, I actually think in terms of machine translation, the large language models are the best thing to happen to neural MT because they're forcing it to develop at a faster pace. And you're going to see the inclusion of LLM-like features into neural machine translation. But because it's purpose-built, it's orders of magnitude more efficient and cost-effective. We're talking about carbon footprint of running ChatGPT versus something like Google Translate. It's just Google Translate is far more efficient.
Right.
But we'll also see, cases where they work collaboratively, like something, an MT engine comes back and says, I don't have relevant training data. Let's kick it out to a large language model and see what it can do. So you'll see, I think it won't be this or that. It's going to be both and.
Okay. Carl, talking about the footprint that Arl was just talking about, the cost of generative AI is pretty exorbitant. It's pretty high. The CPU power and time required to train OpenAI's GPT-3 was more than $5 million. Is that sustainable in the long run, or are we going to live off of 3 large enterprise LLMs, or are smaller SMBs and other people could be able to create their own LLMs at $5 million a pop?
Well, there's not only that, but there's an article in Medium about how much water it takes to actually make these to keep the computing servers cool. So, like, it's using fresh water to keep all the servers cool to do the work to build the models. And so it's not just electricity; there's other resources that are going into this. I think the question of electricity is there's 3 things that you consider when you're going to build a model. It's like how big a model it's going to be, how many things you want to have connected, and then how fast you want it built. And the reality of it is, like, that's where your costs come in. I mean, maybe you could build a model slower and not have it, cost as much to make the same. So it's the amount of data that comes in and the amount of connections, if I didn't say it correctly. So the question is if the bigger you want it to be, the more connections you want between each of the pieces you want in it, and the speed that you want to be created determines how much it costs to build a model. And you're probably not, small to medium companies are not going to build foundation models, most likely,
right,
for the near future. But one of the things that does happen is you can get a foundational model built, and then you can get the model part of it, the part that does the reasoning, and then you can put that on smaller computers. And so then you can fine tune those to be what you need for your specific needs. And small to medium businesses are probably going to be doing more of that. They're not going to build the big foundational ones. But if you say, if somebody goes out there and says, we're going to build one that we're going to feed it all the data in the world that we can get in all the different languages, that's a great thing. What you'd want in the end is just to be able to get the model they create out of that and be able to use that to create your smaller, the one that you're going to use on a day-to-day basis to actually make business decisions or do work like that.
Right. So what a lot of clever vendors are doing now is they're allowing you to choose your foundation model and then create your own knowledge base, which gets inserted into the LLM, so that the LLM gets more guardrails towards your particular domain.
Exactly.
Right. So, Arl, what happens to are we going to be stuck with 3 vendors that create LLMs, or is it going to get democratized?
It will be democratized in 2 ways. One is that right now there's a geopolitical concern. So there's something on the order, I think, of 70 LLM initiatives in China alone right now, because the Chinese government sees this as a national priority. In the EU, we've seen already Aleph Alpha building one. There's a new effort called Nionic out of Germany that's working on building them. So we're going to see the emergence of ones that are tuned to specific needs. And then in terms of democratization, one of the things that we're already seeing is the realization that bigger isn't necessarily better, that
Right.
you can add more and more parameters, but eventually this just starts to collapse under its own weight. And so now there's research being done on how can they optimize this and create much smaller models that are still performative. And as we solve that, then you might say, well, I don't need a foundation model to do this. I can have one that's just optimized around my needs for Finnish, Greek, Estonian, and English in the
Right.
automotive industry, and it's going to do everything I need at, you know, a hundredth the size.
So can a model that size learn the language and learn the grammar and syntax required for the LLM?
It seems so. It's, you know, there's work on how do you prune these models down, but, you know, there's with any of these, you've got, you know, some set of parameters that are very actively used and some that are hardly touched at all. And so if you can narrow down and say, okay, here's the part we need, you can subset. Now that's, I talk about that as if it's trivial. It's not. It's a work in progress, but there's
Right.
indications this is the way it's going to go.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So right now we're in what people call the peak of expectations for generative AI, where it's going to do everything from cook our dinners to take our exams and cure us of our ills. When is the wheat going to hit the chaff and we're going to figure out what this is really all about and good for and not good for? Is that an iterative process, Carl?
Well, definitely iterative, and I think we already hit it because we're starting to hear a lot more about the hallucinations and about a lot of other issues, about the copyright content issues, and where can we bring content into it, what it's allowable, what's moral to bring into it, and then all of the other issues going out the backside, like the hallucination. So I think we're already beginning to go down the hype curve, and I think that it'll probably continue. I don't know how much more. There's a difference saying, generative AI for creating content, I think is peaked for like textual content and stuff like that. And now there's going to be other peaks for animation and 3D and other things like that. And they're going to be kind of continuing pushing it. But they have their own different problems and their own different concerns that are created out of those. And so the things that are, going to begin to, now that we're kind of out of the peak of, like, let's say the text one, and we're going down, people are starting to think, well, I tried to use it for whatever. And I don't know if you also saw that, OpenAI's already started to lose a good percentage of their subscriber base, and they're getting used a lot less than they were before because people tried it and, well, yeah, I wrote cover letters with it and it did a really good job, but then I tried to use it in my job to do something, and, it turned out something that was, my boss looked at and said, I could see that wasn't, you didn't. And so people, I think, are learning that there's boundaries to how good it can do things and in what spaces. And as they do, then you'll start seeing people say, okay, it's good for creating content here, but not so much there. I mean, I think if you try to write a script with it, people try to write books with it, and they say, oh, here, it did this really cool job, this book once. But it's like, okay, can you really learn to write? Can you get it to write a really good book that's different every time without human input? Then people learn, no, you still have to create that differentiated human input for it to create value. And that's where you have to put work into it. It's like, it's not going to be put in one phrase, print me a book, and to create something wonderful. It's write about 2 pages worth of your thoughts about a book and start the process of it, breaking it down into chapters and an outline, and then writing the whole book out again out the back end, which is still a lot of effort.
Yeah. So what's an average day look like for you with generative AI?
Excuse me?
What's an average day for you in front of your generative AI browser?
It's kind of just like in and out, like where I use it just to find something, I use it to expand on something, I use it to summarize something, but it's not using it to do, especially for me right now still, not using it to do any deep work. Though in my space of user experience, there's already sites out there that will create a user experience. And so a lot of navel gazing in the community about, like, our jobs are going to be taken away from it. It's like, and what I've said about in the community on LinkedIn is, like, it's going to take away the low-end jobs, just like when we talk about the lawyers. When you had the law assistants, it's going to take away people who are coming out of boot camps and places where they only learn the fundamental mechanics, but not to think deeply.
Right.
And it's going to be, you want to be in places where you're doing more systems thinking and more broad thinking, to be in a place where you'll be able to keep and have a good job, where it helps you do your job. It doesn't take your job away.
Okay. All right. What's a casual day in front of your generative AI browser look like for you?
So I'm using it in two ways. One is I'm doing research on its capabilities, its strengths and its limitations. So I'm looking at it as a researcher. But the other way I found that I often end up using it is where I have repetitive tasks. For instance, recently I had a list of about 2,000 companies, and I needed to know where their headquarters were. And this is the kind of thing where I'd have to have a research assistant spend hours and hours to try and manually collate this. I'll run it through ChatGPT, and I ran it through, and as a first pass, it was useful. I would say that it got me about 90% of the way there. Now that 10%, what I haven't yet figured is maybe correcting that 10% is going to take longer than it would have been to just
Right.
But there's useful things where it can function something like a retrieval engine, and very, very quickly, that it can be very useful.
You might be able to write a prompt to have it check again.
Yeah.
Right.
You know.
So, one of the things that everybody tells me when they hear about hallucinations is, well, can't you just have an app that checks for veracity? So why can't you just have an app that checks for veracity?
Well, this gets at a fundamental debate in AI circles. There's one camp that argues if you can detect what's wrong, you just improve your model so it doesn't make the mistake. The other camp says, no, you need an antagonistic system that's not subject to the same biases. Now, I tend to subscribe to that latter camp that says you should have a separate thing. And to some extent, if you have a separate process that's checking, what it does is it at least flags easily identifiable problems. But what it can't do is assure you that the remaining data is correct, because it may that secondary process may be incorrect as well.
Right. Okay. So if you're an SMB and you got your own startup, or you got an SMB, what should you be thinking about as the head of a small to medium-sized business when it comes to generative AI? Should you be forging a pathway to embracing it, or should you be waiting for the killer app and not really worrying about it too much right now?
I would say that you really should. I think it's good to worry about it. The first thing you should look at, though, is like, how dependent is your business on an ability to take information and transform it? So like the law, we'll go back to the law one. Their business is a lot about transforming information. And so it's very effective to be able to think about what large language model tools could you use against it. But like if you're an auto mechanic, you don't care, there's almost nothing you do. You could sit there and say, well, it'd be really cool if I could get all my records into a computer and then learn something from them. But if they're not there, it's just not a big worry for you. And it's never going to be the thing that's most going to affect your business, because your business is putting your hands in the car.
Right.
And so, it's going to be, for you, it's going to be 10, 20, 30 years before there's anything that really affects you a lot. There'll be little things that will affect you, like if you were an auto mechanic in your office. So it'll change like some things, your ability to do some of your billing and be able to work with your customers, but it's not going to affect your big business. But if you have a business that's very much, let's say, about taxes or about compliance or about anything where it's looking up a body of information and understanding what you should or shouldn't do in that space, that's where large language models are going to change. And if your business is in there, you need to look at it and decide how much, can I afford for some other company to go in and quickly be able to build a model that does just what I do as a person.
Right. Arl, what's your thought there?
Well, I would say that one of the things you need to think about is the risk associated with the use of it. So I'll use translation as an example. If, I'm translating something like directions for how to navigate around a hotel. then I can use generative AI to do that, because if something goes wrong, the worst case, somebody goes down the wrong hallway and they come back to the
Right,
front
right.
desk. But if I'm translating a medical leaflet, say I'm a maker of orthotic implants, and there's a mistake in that, this could be life and death. I am
Right.
not going to trust generative AI at all. I'm going to go to a qualified medical translator, and even then I'm going to be double checking, because humans, of course, make mistakes. So you have to think of it in terms of risk versus the cost versus the accessibility. And, to use Carl's example of the mechanic too, a mechanic might say, well, great, I'm going to use this and I'm going to throw away all my service manuals. I'll just look up in Chat GPT, how do I replace the alternator in the 2022 Toyota
Right.
Camry?
Mhm.
Sounds great until it makes a mistake and it tells you to torque the wrong torque specification and the alternator falls out.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So what happens to wages in this environment? We've already talked about the fact that people are going to lose their jobs, but the people that are still there, if just in general, as a small to medium-sized business, you need to save up your capital for capital expenditures on on generative AI eventually, maybe hire some prompt engineers. What happens to the business as far as wages? Is this a huddle down and watch your capital time for SMBs, or is this a find capital to expand and start to hire into generative AI?
I think that it's going to vary a lot on the businesses, and saying that they're going to put all their capital into that and not into the people without really knowing what they expect to replace is kind of the big question there. And I don't think people know that yet. I don't think you can say right now, oh, this is going to affect wages or not, right now. I think this is the beginning of that curve of understanding how do businesses uptake this, and what part of my business do I let it affect? It could, think about it. You could actually just grow your business with it. You've got a bunch of people, they're knowledgeable about what they do, and now what you're going to do is you're going to use this to enable them so that you can reach more people. That's a great thing to do. Instead of looking at it as like, oh, I'm going to take people that I do have and I'm going to remove them because I'm going to create something that takes away the need for them.
Right.
And truthfully, the reality of it is humans being humans, you're going to get both.
Right. Right. Arl?
Yeah, I'd agree. You're going to see some that benefit wage-wise and some that are hurt deeply. I'd say if you're looking at it from a wage perspective as a business owner, one thing you should look at when you encounter a claim about generative AI is to say, can it really do this? Because there are a whole lot of claims being made in the tech press and elsewhere. Gen AI can do things that it cannot do.
Mm-hmm.
So then you make a decision, like one company I'm aware of fired its entire translation team, said, we're just going to replace it with Chat GPT. Sounds great, but translation isn't everything that team did.
Right.
And now they fire him. They've hollowed out that experience. They're going to have to start from ground zero, rebuilding what they've lost. They're going to have to pay significantly more than they would have if they hadn't done it. So you have to really look and understand what it is you're trying to replace and what its value is. And it will force some hard discussions. I think it's going to be the benefit of some and the detriment of others.
Yep. So we're going to open it up for questions in a few minutes, but let me ask another set of let me ask you guys about modalities. So right now, when I think about generative AI, and obviously there are a lot of areas that I also know of that most people don't, but it's basically marketing concepts, things that are textual. But I think, Arl, you mentioned it before, Carl, you did too, about generative AI can generate paintings. It can generate, I'm not sure if it can generate videos yet or not. But
Quality-wise.
But where is it going to grow as far as modalities are concerned? And do we know if textual will start to fall on the wayside as people begin to understand the ability of it to generate audio, video, and images?
Well, go ahead, Carl.
Go ahead, Carl.
Um, the thing you have to think about is right now there's already tools for generating 3D and for generating video and generating audio, and like, you know, Google created one that, you know, generates music. But like if you look farther out, you can see like Microsoft created a connection between a large language model and robots. So it's like it's generating the ability to control a robot. And so you have that language. It's like it changes the ability for you to, you know, generate the capability to, and then put something else on the other side of that. And it's very, you know, life and business changing at that point. So, you know, yes, text is an area. I think it's still growing. I think it'll grow for probably another 5 years where people really start understanding what text can do for them. And it's going to be very differentiating in how we live and work. So it's not like that's going to become small anytime in the very near future.
Okay.
What you're going to see though is the cross modality stuff between like, you know, text to image, images to text, you know, to video, to, you know, these other things. If you look at it, it's like one of the things they said is there's now generative AI to create Roblox environments where you can just sit there and say, you know, create a field, and the thing, you know, it creates a field. You know, put a clearing in the field, put a campfire in the clearing, and it can do all of that. And what you can do when you think about all those creative things is it can do that in a very generic way. But if you wanted a very specific campfire in that field, you'd like to have it to be like, you know, have a certain artistic style. It's not going to have that. So you're going to be creating a lot of very generic stuff where the system already knows how to do it, but you're still looking for the very specific creative content that a person can create to create new, you know, a specific look that somebody's able to create.
Right.
Versus ones that there are, I mean, at this point, if you can name a style visually, it's going to create something in that style. But if you want it to be, if you want something created very specifically, it's like, I want a peach and I want it to like turn 90 degrees, blah, 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 a whole bunch of things like that. That's a farther out. It may happen one day, but there's still the need for people to, again, describe exactly what they want in a way these things can understand.
So just to expand on what you were saying about styles, one of the great things about generative AI is it has style transfer capabilities. So you can say, draw me a picture of a horse on a farm in the style of Pablo Picasso, and it will generate that and do what's called a style transfer and actually make it look like Picasso drew it based on its knowledge of how Picasso drew. So Arl, let me go back to you now on the same question.
Yeah, so I think one area we're going to see a lot of work on is linking modalities right now. And I don't know whether that's going to mean we're going to see the convergence into single models that include spoken language, written language, and images. But a lot of human intelligence in a lot of the areas where there could apply would rely on linking those modalities so that you could include images as context with a written language prompt or audio recordings and say, you know, clean up this audio recording by, you know, running a high pass filter and removing speech stutters and things. That would be very interesting. So I think there's going to be a lot of work around the modalities. There's something else I was going to say, but it's gone, so I'll just stop there.
Okay, so one of the modalities that we didn't talk about when we were talking about SMBs that I just realized we skipped is the ability of ChatGPT or of LLMs to program. So as a programmer myself, I constantly use ChatGPT I say, write me a C# program to do the following, and it'll spit out C# code that's as good as any code I can write, or maybe even better. And the great thing about it is it writes the code, you test the code, it has an error, you tell it the error, and it says, oh yes, I forgot that such and such and such does this and this, and that was ruled out in 1987, and here's the right code. So have either of you used it to write code before?
Yeah. I've had it write like macros for Google Sheets to be able to format things. And I wanted to find out how good it could help write a program. So I wanted to create a program where you could translate from drawing stuff to embroidery. and just to
Okay.
see if it could do it, because my sister has a machine. It's like, I'd like a thing that could do that. And I had it working through the steps of doing that. And then I showed it to friends who are, professional programmers, and they're like, well, that's kind of a good direction. That's really neat. But, as a, professional person, I would do this here and that there. And what I think you're going to see is that you're going to start seeing coding companions that don't just like look at a little piece of your code, but you have a higher level conversation about what you're trying to do, and it can ask you questions about it and say, like, how, where are you trying to deploy this? Who, do you want to deploy it on iOS? Do you want to deploy it, as an Android app? Okay, best practices for making it, very optimized in this way are this, that, and the other thing. Do you want me to do that for this? And so I think over time, it can even take on a lot more of the more professional level capabilities of programmers, which probably is scary for them, but it'll make it easier for people who, like me, who only have medium at best knowledge for programming.
Okay. Arl, have you used it at all for doing macros and programming type things?
Yeah, I've run some experiments. One time, maybe this makes me really nerdy, but in the New York Times, there's a puzzle called, I can't remember what it's called, but it had Letterbox. And I'd written a program to try and solve Letterbox, got it about halfway done. I was just messing around. And I used it as a prompt without telling it what it was and said, write a program to solve Letterbox. And it took my code and completed it
Wow.
up to a pretty decent standpoint. Now, I didn't do some optimization and stuff I would have done, but
Right.
I was pretty impressed. I also use it routinely to create regular expressions when I don't want to sit there and try and figure out why one isn't working. And I've had it write complex Excel formula with middling success. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's just not at all.
Interesting. It'd be nice if it could write an application to solve Wordle for me every morning.
Yeah.
Although I think I enjoy doing it too much. So again, to the folks that are listening in, if you want to type your questions in the chat box, we're going to wrap up in about 15 minutes, but we do want to answer any questions you might have. Just as a general takeaway, so again, the title of this session was Generative Artificial Intelligence. Will it change the way we work? Carl and Arl, if there's one takeaway from this session that you want people to have, what would it be?
So
Go, Arl.
to give one takeaway, I would say that, you need to see this as a tool. And if you as an individual need to learn how to use it and look at how can you use it to better yourself. It's the people who are sitting waiting for this to act upon them that are going to be the losers in this, because they're going to get blindsided. But if you're looking at it saying, how can I use this to make myself more valuable, to contribute more to my company's goals, you're going to be in a good position. The other thing I would say with it as well is specialize. It's generalists that are going to be easy to replace, but specialists who have deep knowledge and can apply generative AI to their tasks are going to be really strengthened by it.
Right. So, and go ahead, Carl. Let me get some feedback from you.
Well, no, I think there's two things there I really like from Arl. One of them was the term blindsided. I wrote an article about this, and that's what I kind of said for small to medium businesses, is that because they don't tend to be as tech focused, what's out there, I mean, they kind of hear about this, and like you said, they're going to wait for it to come to them. And if they do, I do think that they're going to be blindsided by like other companies. Like one of the things I did is I went in and just to test it out and said, like, what if I wanted to use, if I was a company who had general analytics and I wanted to go into a really specific area, and that specific area, because I have a background from it at GE, was wind turbines. And so I used it to say, tell me the failure modes of wind turbines. And it did. Then I asked it, like, how would I find these failure modes? And it told me that. And then I said, what are the parameters I need to understand to test for these failure modes? And it told me that. You can learn about a subject area very quickly with it. So it's going to make it so that other companies will decide, I'd like to get into that area. give them the ability to really quickly move into something that you think you're very specialized in. And I would say, as a company, you're only very specialized in things that are in that it's your own protected IP, versus anything that you do that's out there in the general public that any of these large language models could have picked up.
Right.
And so the thing you really need to be aware of is like, okay, the thing that you can grow in, like Earl said, is if you're specialized, it's great because it's probably not much of it out there that a LLM will have picked up that you can use for any AI model, whatever the modality is. If you're specialized in it, it's something that you can use to better yourself and your company, and you don't have to worry as much that an outside company will do it. But whatever you do that is not very specialized that you could expect to see out there in the world is going to be something that anybody could go out and say, oh, okay, I'm going to learn about it quickly and figure out how to code something that works against it quickly, because they can now use these tools to do both of those things.
Right. Okay, excellent. So Dana has a question, and it has to do with bias. And let's hold on one second. Here we go. What are some of the considerations for testing bias on text generating LLMs? How should we consider bias testing? Very specific question, technical question, but any thoughts on that?
That's a really interesting and non-trivial question. I mean, a lot of people do testing on this, but in terms of systematic testing, I haven't seen a lot that's done. It tends to be anecdotal or running small numbers of queries and seeing what happens. Then keep in mind that, biases in these models aren't created by the models, they're created by the training data. So they're reflecting the bias of what goes into them. And that makes it particularly hard to eradicate, because now if you say, well, we don't want to use gendered language to refer to doctors as males and nurses as females, now that means somebody's writing basically a special case on top of the LLM to try and correct this.
Right.
And so you end up with this just hodgepodge of kludges trying to solve the problems that emerge because you're holding up a mirror to the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think by the fact that we're combing through billions of web pages, we inherit the biases of those web pages. And I'm not sure testing for it means anything. We're not going to exclude web pages. The idea is to be so voluminous on what you bring into the LLM is what gives it its value and gives it its intelligence, quote unquote.
I've added on top of that, by the way, that one area we've seen a lot of our clients use LLMs already is to rewrite content that they see as problematic. So they'll say something like, rewrite this to be gender inclusive. And the LLMs actually do a very good job of that. So you can use them to fight whatever bias it is that you particularly want to eliminate.
So how do these LLMs exist on a daily basis? Are there people constantly testing against them and fixing them and finding things that they don't want? I mean, there are guardrails now against sexually offensive information and things like that. Are those in constant motion by these large companies that own these LLMs?
It is cat and mouse constantly.
Yeah, everything I've heard is like, and I think that's like when you hear about it, like especially if you hear like Facebook creating their own, they're trying to use it for content moderation. You just have to think that, they are in a complete cycle. Oh, okay, we went after this thing. We thought we had some solve against it. People find a way to get around it, and that's always like the security one. It's not that kind of chasing bias and things like that is not unlike chasing security problems, in that side of the world. It's always it exists. People are able to change things to make it the way that they want it. They'll change their language. They'll talk about it in a different way to get around any restrictions you might put in it. But I think it's actually it's really cool, the idea of saying, okay, we can use them to write out some of those things. So I think that, like, if you talk about feedback mechanisms, like in cybernetics, you create a feedback mechanism where you have it try to write out that kind of thing and just see where that goes. But again, as with all feedback mechanisms, you need to be, have a mechanism in there to watch what's happening and make sure it's doing the right thing.
Yeah. So a bunch of people are asking about resources that you can share in terms of researching more about LLMs and generative AI. And I would just globally respond by saying both these guys are on LinkedIn and they both write a lot of information about resources and their thoughts on LLMs and generative AI. So I suggest you follow them on LinkedIn and read what they've got there, and that'd be a good place. Any other suggestions, Arl and Carl, on great places for resources?
Yeah, I just put into the chat a link to an article recently published on Archive called Challenges and Applications of Large Language Models. Fantastic article for anyone who wants to understand what these things are and how they work. And the other thing I would say is Google has published a bunch of videos. If you just want the basics, they're really good videos that, and I don't have a link to them, but you can go look for Google's videos on generative AI, and they will really set you up. Very good series.
Awesome. Well, it's 4 minutes before the hour. You guys are both superstars. I appreciate so much both of you being with us for the hour. I'm going to turn it back over to Christina. Christina, what do you want to wrap up with?
Thank you, you guys. I just was going to say my experience was I have used ChatGPT a couple of times because my boss, Dr. Aydin, is very big on using it. And I do think it does help because he is Turkish. So it does help when he's writing his papers. He can put it in there and it can help check some of his grammar or check some of that. And I do see where that comes in handy. I've used it because I am also in my other role, I'm a birth doula, and I've had to write a blog post, and I've been like 3 months behind before, and I was like, oh man. And I was like, you know what, let me chat GPT something, and I did, and it pulled up stuff, and then I just went in and I made changes so that it sounded like me. Like I was like, I don't speak like that, I don't speak, so I've enjoyed that part of it. I think a lot of people get scared that the world is going to turn into all automated robots taking over we've had so many movies of robots taking over the world. So we have one more question. I don't know if we can say that. Carl, I don't know if that was a reply to that, but
I just put a video, interesting video like that I found recently about an observation on generalization, which I think is a good exploration of generative AI and the limits of it and things of that nature. So that was an interesting video. It's just one I happen to have up. Not like, I don't find it more interesting or better than any other one.
right.
I'd find. And just a note, so I write about it on Medium. So if you look up my name, Carl Muckle, on Medium, that's where the article that I think that Brian found me on. So
Awesome.
Donna Wong asked if either of you have entered coding samples into more than one chatbot to see how they differ. I know I always use OpenAI, so I haven't tried coding from other sources other than GPT-4.
no, I mean, the only thing I've done is because I used Visual Studio Code, I've had Copilot for a while, and it expands on when you start writing stuff, it'll expand out the procedures and functions and variables if it thinks like it knows where you're going with that kind of stuff. And it's kind of like a good sometimes thing. Sometimes like, no, you don't know where I'm trying to go. Stop doing that. Annoyingly. But I haven't tried. I mean, it's too much effort to try to say, I'm going to go try it in different ones. I guess Claude is another one. And Claude actually, I don't know, Arl, have you looked at Claude? Because that's supposed to be more about different languages.
No, I haven't.
Yeah. So that's supposed to be trained on different languages, I believe. So it might be better for the machine translation kind of stuff.
Okay.
Very good. I agree. Dana put in the chat, excellent session. I grew taller, and I agree because I was like, oh, I've been watching everything back and forth, but then I've stopped every once in a while and listened really intently. So I've been listening, but sometimes I was able to really listen real intent. So I enjoyed the conversation, and thank you all very much. So I'm gonna just unspotlight you guys so you don't have to keep staying in the spotlight here. And I was going to say, if there's anybody that would like to, so I thank you guys for both being with us, or actually all three of you. And Brian, I appreciate you bringing this discussion to Atlantic Institute, because I think it was a great thing to learn about, and I look forward to more of these. So, and I thank you guys for joining us and taking time out of your day and your afternoons. Sorry, it's 8 o'clock in the evening here. I know it's not everywhere else. So, and thank you very much for all of the comments and the different links in the chat. And so if, I guess we can go ahead and wrap it up. Yep, Jeffrey has to leave for work. So, we can go ahead and wrap it up. If you guys would like to unmute yourself, and you can say thank you and say good evening or good afternoon, depending, or good morning, depending on where you're seeing us from. You can feel free to.